Now it is. Okay. Part 1 is The Bow is Drawn. No One Here Gets Out Alive. We read the first chapter of Part 1. This second chapter will take us through to page 55. We're going to go fast because we actually read it yesterday and we weren't recording. So this is our second time, which is like sort of beyond torturous having to do this. Okay. Chapter 2. Jim stood on the hot Florida curb, peeling off his black suit coat. Jim is Jim Morrison. Are you ready? Ripping open the tab collar of his clean white shirt, tearing away the red striped tie, the uniform of St. Petersburg J.C., the up-county bus that took him home threw open its doors. Oh, you're going to love this story. This is the stupidest joke. Jim slumped into a seat about midway back and began whistling, then produced 2 or 3 long, low belches, a noisy, self-conscious prelude to one of the rambling, sorry jokes and tall tales he liked to tell. You know, so there's really no reason to include it here. Okay, I had a friend who wanted to buy a duck hunting dog, Jim announced, so he went to an old-timer and asked how he could be sure he got a good one. The old-timer told my friend to look at the dog's asshole because you need a dog with a tight asshole, so when he jumps into the water, all the water won't run in and make him sick. So my friend goes to the local kennel, where he's shown a number of dogs and told the price is $75 a piece. My friend tells the kennel owner he'd like to examine the dogs closely. Are you going to tell this joke at our shows?
No.
All right. When Jim began the story, it seemed he was talking to himself, but soon everyone near him was straining to hear. Yeah. And he goes over to a big friendly-looking dog and moves to another dog. The kennel owner comes over at that, pointing to the first dog. "What the fuck are you doing to my dog?" he says. "Well," says my friend, "I've just been looking at the dog's asshole, and it's pretty big, see? So when he jumps in the water after the duck, the water will run in and he'll sink." The kennel owner takes a look and says, "Yeah, the asshole is big, isn't it?" And he reaches out, grabs the old dog's balls, and gives him about a half turn, and that old asshole cinches up tight. "Sorry," the kennel owner says to my friend, "I had the dog, adjusted for quail." Jim went into his long hee-hee-hee laugh and started another story, ignoring the groans and stony silences. Soon the other students on the bus were listening intently again. The school bus dropped Jim 3 blocks from where he lived. It was a short walk, but long enough to devise some means of hassling his Grandmommy Caroline and Grandpa Paul. Both the elder Morrisons were teetotalers, and although Paul had a weakness for the dog races, the prevailing attitudes in the comfortable home in the older section of town were fundamentalist. Jim mocked them. He ignored their pleas to get a haircut, to shave, to change his clothes, to go to church, to do anything reasonable. He threatened to bring a girl home, and he left empty wine bottles in his room. Sometimes he said nothing for days. He came into and left their daily schedule like black smoke. He hated conformity. He'd always get some queer slant on things, his grandmother recalls. He'd try to shock us. Anybody listening, I honestly think this chapter is really, really boring. It goes all the way up to where he meets Ray Manzarak, and that's, I think, like when the Doors is going to start, and it's probably a little bit more interesting. This is a slog. He's gonna go through UCLA. It's dumb. It's just nobody famous pops up. The stories are just, but whatever. Just so you know. Not to discourage you. Maybe we'll say something
Just go.
funny. Okay, he hated conformity. He'd always get some queer slant on things, his grandmother recalls. He'd try to shock us. He loved to do that. He'd tell us things that he knew would make us feel queer. We just didn't understand him, any of us. There were so many sides to Jimmy. You'd see one, then get a glimpse of another. You never knew what he was thinking. Jim walked through the academic year at JC anonymously, ignoring all extracurricular activities. His first semester grades were unspectacular: 1A, 2 Bs, 1 C, and a D. More interesting were the findings of the personality test given all new students. On these, Jim was adjudged impulsive, happy-go-lucky, and excitement-loving, as opposed to disciplined and self-controlled. But, paradoxically, he was also judged to be shy and interested in overt activity as well as thinking, extremely hypocritical of social institutions, given to self-pity, and surprisingly macho considering his leanings towards literature and his strength in composition and communication, as shown in his records from Alexandria. Jim was capable of stunts of intellectual virtuosity. When friends visited his room, he challenged them. Go ahead, pick a book, any book. His voice was boastful, but he toed the carpet of his bedroom, the shy magician. Pick any book. Open it to the beginning of any chapter and start reading. I'll keep my eyes closed, and I'll tell you what book you're reading and who the author is. Jim swept one arm around the room with the hundreds and hundreds of books on top of the furniture and stacked everywhere against the walls. He never missed. That's not impressive. Because think about this, like if you hear one note from a song, you can say what it is. Or if you see a second of an episode of Game of Thrones, you'd know which one it was.
And didn't you say a paragraph?
I think he's saying the first line, but I don't remember. Pick any book, open it up to the beginning of the chapter, and start reading.
Yeah,
I'll keep my eyes closed. I mean, that might mean start reading, and eventually I'll know what book it is and who it's by. So all it means is that, like, he has
knowledge,
and that he has a knowledge of what books he owns, or what books are in his room.
And has an okay memory at least.
I know, it's like honestly, if you pick, okay, so I've got a few records over here. Here's a little record collection right back here. It's behind this. Right here. Okay. Now, if I said, Inez, take any of these albums, any of these records, put one on, and I'll tell you who it is. The fuck?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a gift.
How does he do it? Turn a radio on to the oldies station. Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. Next. Fucking hey, man. Amazing stunts of intellectual virtuosity, such as recognizing colors. More generous, but no less memorable, was the time he helped a friend with her term paper, instantly and expertly analyzing a sizable bulk of poetry. For another friend, he wrote a 30-page essay on Lord Essex, one of Queen Elizabeth's paramours, and provided a lengthy bibliography, all off the top of his head. I fucking simply don't believe that. I don't believe it.
That he wrote the paper off the top of his head?
No, that he wrote the bibliography off the top of his head.
Oh.
Page 232, Simon & Schuster, 1927. Lord...
He's like Sherlock. Jim Morrison is the musical Sherlock.
He spent the entire 1950s in his palace. What is it called?
Mind Palace.
His mind palace. Recalling things. Okay, we're never going to get done. Okay. I had to write and give a speech on moral integrity, imperative for our survival, says Jim's brother Andy. I didn't even know what the fuck that meant. My parents wouldn't let me leave the house for Easter vacation until I finished it, and Jim wanted me to go out with him. I worked on it a couple of days, and Jim finally took it and rewrote it for me, throwing in a lot of his own stuff at the end. The speech was pretty good, and it ended, "We are drifting in blind orbits, helpless, alone." There were 3 or 4 sentences in a row like that, and although it wasn't quite my style, I got an A on the speech. Okay. All right, I'm not going to keep doing this, but here's the thing. So how does the guy writing this book has to be interviewing Andy, and Andy remembers that off the top of his head 20 years later? I remember
or he has the paper sitting around.
Exactly. That's what I'm thinking. Here, let me, like he's living through, anyway, that's not a big deal. Okay, Jim fell in with a small band of graduates of Clearwater High School with whom he drank. He got drunk at dances and stood in the corner pretending to be a tree. Neat. He got drunk at parties and once cut himself badly. Even neater. But was so belligerent and insulting that the doctor at a local hospital refused to treat him. Good. Jim wasn't yet into heavy, steady drinking. Yeah. Uh, as one classmate observed, it was as if he drank only to get drunk. Otherwise, he didn't drink at all. For Jim, getting intoxicated was a special occasion, but already it was an apparent form of relief. One significant occasion came on his 18th birthday in December, when he registered for the draft. Jim hated the military with a desperate fury, fearing its awesome grip of authority. In 1961,
It's not that uncommon.
its awesome grip of authority.
Can you stop adjusting how you're sitting and just hurry up? Ella, get up there. Hi. Come here.
In 1961, there was no popular anti-war movement. Jim never heard the words conscientious objector, so he registered, and then he went out and got roaring drunk. Members of the family say an uncle who lived in Clearwater extricated him from a sticky situation that night that could have resulted in an injurious scandal. It was so embarrassing to them, apparently they still won't reveal what it was. About the same time, Jim found a refuge, an old hotel in the Palmetto Wilderness between Clearwater and St. Petersburg, the Renaissance Gallery and Coffee House, a rabbit warren of studios, stages, and patios that was on the junior college's unofficial off-limits list. That's probably what attracted Jim, but it was the poetry readings, folk singing contests, and prevailing bohemianism that held him. The Renaissance was run by a garrulous...
It's not the first time that they used bohemianism in this chapter.
That makes sense.
They use it again when they were talking about Venice Beach.
Yeah. Well, that's what it was. It was just sort of that era.
Oh, okay.
The Renaissance is run by a garrulous, middle 30-ish homosexual named Alan Rhodes. Half an hour after meeting him, Jim was given the verbal equivalent of an epic novel. A thicket of information that included stories of ancestors who'd done the engineering of St. Petersburg in the 19th century, wildly exaggerated adventures of sexual conquest during the blackouts of wartime London, tales of Rhodes' days with Red Sean's all-male dance troupe, the family origin of sexual proclivity of every cat prowling the gallery labyrinth, knowing references to the Garden of Eden Newton's camp north of Tampa, and every declaration introduced with the expression, "You won't believe this, you'll drop dead." Alan remembers telling Jim, only wish. Alan remembers telling Jim how Jim had it, just like Elvis. And he recalls saying that when he was in London during the war and went cruising for whatever he might attract on the streets, he never wore any underpants. Show your meat is what I told everybody. I never knew it to fail. And, we'll find out in later chapters that Jim Morrison never wore any underpants. And I think that the reason they're saying that here is that the writers assume that that's such a well-known part of the Jim Morrison lore that they can just kind of refer to it as if we're going to find, as if we'll be like, oh, well, that must be why he never wears underwear, because old Dusty Rhodes or whoever his name, Alan Rhodes, never wore underwear.
Thing is, nobody cares. Nobody cares that Jim Morrison didn't wear underwear.
Okay, I know, but at the time, I think they did. This is,
It's not that time anymore.
No, but I'm just saying, it's good we're reading this. Your mom asked today why we're reading it, and I don't really know, but it is kind of good that because I don't think people remember Jim Morrison. I feel like he might be sort of a prototype for Kurt Cobain.
Can you read so we can finish it?
Jim visited his family, now living in a suburb of San Diego, at the end of the school year. When he returned to Clearwater in July, he finally met someone to take over Tandy Martin's role as girlfriend and confidant. Bye, Tandy. Mary Frances Werbelow was almost 16. Good luck, Tandy. Just over 5 feet tall, had long brown hair, and was a runner-up in that summer Sun and Fun beauty contest. She had just finished her junior year at Clearwater High when Jim met her at a party. Hey, everybody, look at there, a voice warned. Jim was balanced on one foot on the balcony railing of an apartment building, teetering 20 feet above the ground. Hey, y'all been drinking, boy? Laughter. Jim placed his right foot down on the railing and lifted his left, slipped, and began beating his arms. He was falling. The boy and girl standing closest to him grabbed him and pulled him back into the party. You shouldn't have done that, Jim said to the girl. As long as it's you, it's okay, though. He gave her an irresistible, boyish smile. Mary was a Catholic and had once considered becoming a nun. I think we're supposed to read that as if he was like James Dean. She was quiet like Jim, and it gave her an air of maturity. She told Jim she taught part-time at the local Fred Astaire dance studio, and she wanted to be a dancer in movies someday. She warmed immediately to Jim when he said he wanted to write and direct movies. Do you write poetry? Jim asked. Sometimes, but I don't show it to anybody. I've got some poems. You do? In the final week of summer vacation, Jim became an influence in Mary Frances' life. At his urging, she quit wearing underwear. She began wearing sunglasses in defiance of local convention. She tried alcohol for the first time. Then she told her parents that she was going to visit Jim for the weekends when he started classes at Florida State University in Tallahassee in September. Every night, Jim stood in his underwear in the middle of the small bedroom and stretched, reaching for the ceiling on his toes. He told his roommate he did it to make himself taller, and he appeared to believe it worked. Jim weighed 132 pounds and was 5 feet 8 and 3/4 inches tall when he left Alexandria, and he said he'd grown more than an inch since. He was sharing a modern 3-bedroom house a mile from the FSU campus with 5 other students. He had known only 2 of them previously. The others were housemates of convenience. As was his custom, he began testing his roommates immediately. He had become obsessed about Elvis Presley and insisted upon silence whenever Elvis Presley's records were playing on the radio, turning the volume up and sitting in the front of the radio mesmerized. When his grandparents sent him an electric blanket, he refused to pay his share of the heating bill. On Halloween, Jim embarrassed everyone by greeting the young trick-or-treaters dressed only in a large cape, which he threw open once they came inside the house for candy he offered them.
I said this yesterday, but he would be arrested if that was the case today. If someone was doing that today.
I kind of think he might be arrested if that was the case then, too. You want to read it, though?
Where are you?
Right here.
Jim also caused trouble on the buses that he and his housemates took to class. Once he gave the driver a $20 bill and argued belligerently when the driver told him he had no change. Another time he walked to the rear of the bus and noisily insisted that all the blacks move to the front. Then one day he sat behind the driver next to a 10-year-old girl and smiled at her. "Hello," he said. The girl sat stiffly in her seat, darting her eyes nervously at Jim. "You sure are purty," Jim said, dropping into his yokel voice. The girl was embarrassed. "You sure got pretty legs," Jim said. The bus driver looked into his rearview mirror to see Jim leaning toward the girl and putting his hand on her knee. The bus jerked to a halt at the curb and the driver spun around. "Out, young man, get out." "Oh, please, kind sir," Jim whined. "It was a compliment offered in innocence. She reminds me of my younger sister at home. I was homesick for a moment, sir." Finally, the driver relented, telling Jim he could remain on the bus if he kept his hands to himself. All his roommates were on the bus, and all pretended not to know him, but he was the first to... This is the one joke I like.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah, this is a good one.
All his roommates were on the bus, and all pretended not to know him. But he was the first to alight once the bus reached the campus, and he turned and called, "Hey, roomies," and waved. Automatically, they all waved back. Then Jim called, "Fuck you," and bowed and laughed and strutted away. He borrowed a Thunderbird belonging to one of his housemates and backed it into a telephone pole. He drank their beers, ate their food, wore their clothes without asking. He kept careful records of all his actions and then their reactions, writing in his journals as if he were an anthropologist and his roommates were his subjects. In less than 3 months' time, Jim had the household frantic. Everyone was living in a constant state of anxiety over what was going to happen next. It all blew up one night in December, near the end of the trimester, when Jim was playing Elvis too loud. They told him he was going to have to straighten up or move out. Jim straightened his back. He said it was their problem. He wasn't doing anything they shouldn't be able to put up with. They weren't putting out any effort, and why should they ask him to change when he wasn't asking them to change? They ended up asking him to move out. Jim said okay and peacefully moved his stuff that night, and the next day he was gone. He moved into a half-trailer behind a girls' boarding house 3 blocks from campus. For this, he paid $50 a month, half the sum his grandparents sent him. His parents sent him money, too, whenever he wrote them a letter. He had to write a letter every month to get a check, says his brother Andy. He wouldn't write about dates or anything. He'd tell a story about how he was at a movie theater when a fire broke out and everybody panicked and stormed the doors, and he was the only one who remained calm. He got up onto the stage, sat at the piano and sang a song and calmed the audience so that they were exited from the theater safely.
Heroic.
Another letter was filled with
The
details
heroic
about
Jim
how
Morrison.
he watched a guy drown in a swamp. Jim took influential courses that second trimester. One examined the philosophies of protest, considering those thinkers who are critical or skeptical of and in revolt against philosophic tradition. How do you say that?
Montaigne, Rousseau, Hume, Sartre, Heidegger, and Jim's favorite, Nietzsche.
Okay. The second course was on collective behavior. Psychology of crowds. Professor James Geschwinder was a short, round man with dark hair, and Jim was one of his best students. He could draw the professor into amazing discussions, says Brian Gates, a fellow classmate, and the rest of us would sit there dumbfounded. Jim seemed to know so much about the human nature. He effortlessly coasted through the class. I slogged through the books, but you'd have thought Jim wrote them. The professor deferred to him in class and told us that Jim's final thesis was the best he had ever seen from any student with Jim's limited education preparation. In fact, he said it would do any doctoral candidate justice. While still in high school, Jim had read Norman O. Brown's Freudian's interpretation of history, life against death, and its thesis that mankind must be viewed as largely unaware of its own desires, hostile to life, and unconsciously bent on self-destruction greatly appealed to him. Repression had not only caused individuals' neurosis. Brown wrote about social
Pathological?
Pathology.
Pathologies?
Yeah, pathology as well. Jim concluded that crowds could have sexual neurosis much like those of individuals, and that these derangements could be quickly and effectively diagnosed and then treated. The teacher was enthralled. The final classes were given over to a discussion of the thesis, says Brian, with Geschwinder and Jim doing all the talking. They left the rest of us behind. We didn't know what they were talking about. Eager to test this theory, Jim urged 3 of his acquaintances to join him in disrupting a campus speaker. I can look at a crowd, he said to his friends. I can just look at it, and it's all very scientific, and I can diagnose the crowd I hate this book.
Where? Psychology.
Oh.
Psychologically.
Oh, okay. Psychologically. Just 4 of us properly positioned can turn the crowd around. We can cure it. We can make love to it. We can make it right. This book is really, really boring to read, and especially this chapter. Jim's friends looked at him blankly. Hey, man, Jim said, don't you even want to try? His friends went away.
Remember the time he got off the bus and yelled, fuck you to his friends?
That was the 1 second in the entire book so far that was remotely funny. That's dumb. On weekends, Jim often hitchhiked the 200 miles back to Clearwater to see Mary. He remained entranced by her innocence, in awe of her psychological and physical virginity. She sang and danced. She liked to walk barefoot in the rain. Other than Mary, Jim's only close friends during the second trimester was Brian Gates, who looked a little like a young Basil Rathbone and, like Jim, had a father who had spent at least half his life in the military. When Jim harassed Brian for studying for a career in commerce, Brian would agree that he was superficial and crass. His good-natured refusal to let Jim get to him cemented their relationship. It was not surprising when Jim asked Brian if he'd like to accompany him on the hitchhiking journey across the United States when the trimester ended and Brian graduated in April. Jim had already established quite a reputation as a hitchhiker. Several times during his travels between Tallahassee and Clearwater, he had refused to ride, once after standing for an hour in the rain, merely because the driver looked uninterested. Brian thought it over and said he was agreeable. Jim and Brian partied for 2 weeks in Clearwater, during which time Jim made plans for Mary to join him in California after she graduated from high school in June. Once together in Los Angeles, they planned to get an apartment and jobs and enroll at University of California. Then he told Mary he would realize his lifelong dream of enrolling in the School of Cinematography so he could learn to translate his ideas and fantasies into film. Then Jim and Brian headed west, spending 6 days on the road that would have made Jack Kerouac proud. They were arrested by the police in Mobile, Alabama at 4 a.m. In New Orleans the following day, Jim went roaring into what he called the fringes, to converse with what he thought was a hermaphroditic bartender, then tried to pick up a lesbian whose lover pulled the knife and threatened to carve him up. See, him and Mary are still doing good, and he's still doing all this weird thing. weird things.
I don't think Mary is fully committed to him. It doesn't seem like,
Yeah, but at this point, they're not like falling apart or what. They're not growing apart because later, remember, it's like they grew apart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
In East Texas, they were given a ride by a cousin of Vice President Lyndon Johnson and taken to LBG's birthplace and then to LBG's ranch, where they were fed barbecued beef and introduced to Johnson's aunt. They entered Mexico at Juarez at midnight, and Jim talked all night in his high school Spanish with a Mexican prostitute in a boozy native cantina. In Phoenix, they were picked up at 6 a.m. by a girl who immediately told them, "I might as well live with you. I need a man and I need one bad," causing Brian to grab the wheel, forcing the car to the curb. "Come on, man, let's take her up on it," said Jim. At 6 in the morning, "She wants to take us to her apartment? No way, you go ahead. I'm getting out of here." Reluctantly, Jim followed his friend. See, Jim wanted... Whatever.
What?
It's another one. When they arrived in Coronado the following afternoon, the reception was grim. First, Jim's mother told him he couldn't enter the house until he had got a haircut. She also told him that she was appalled by his hitchhiking after she had sent him the plane fare. Later...
Hey, you know what I was thinking of the other night?
What?
Jim's mom's name is Clara.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any square name than Clara? I mean, isn't that like the...
No. There's a cool Clara in Doctor Who. It's actually the only other Clara I know.
Tony's daughter Clara, but it's like Clara.
Later she... I don't know.
Vociferously.
Is that just like distraught or something?
Like very, very verbally.
No.
And forcefully.
Disapproved of his regular trips into San Diego, where he and Brian were exploring the poker parlors and rough Navy bars. But what really stunned her was Jim's announcement that he was going to Los Angeles to enroll in UCLA. "Just wait until your father comes home," she said. "You just wait. He'll be home in less than a month," but then Jim was gone. For 3 weeks, Jim and Brian looked for jobs and partied with Brian's cousins in East Los Angeles, living in a small house trailer. But there were no jobs, and eventually there was no more money for partying. The adventure and fantasy crumbled. Then Jim's mother called to say his father was landing in a few days in Long Beach. "I expect you to be at the docks," she told him. Jim hung up without promising, but he was there. He told his parents he wanted to remain in Los Angeles, but they forbade it. Jim presented a dozen alternatives, all rejected, and 2 weeks later he was escorted to a plane bound for Florida in time to register for an abbreviated summer term. Jim determinedly moved back into his book-littered trailer on College Avenue, and on June 18th signed up for the least number of courses he could get away with, and it was an uneventful summer except for a course in medieval European history. Jim told his professor he wanted to write one long research paper, not the two little assigned essays, and he wanted to choose his own subject.
Do you want me to?
It was fine for now. It was quite unprecedented, but I was intrigued, so I agreed, the teacher recalls. Jim wrote about, I don't know how to say that,
Hieronymus Bosch. I think
Hieronymus
it's
Bosch, the Dutch painter who viewed the world as a hell in which we pass through the devil's digestive system, and about whom almost nothing is known for sure. Jim's theory was that the artist was a member of the Adamite sect, a group of medieval heretics. "I was unconvinced," the professor says, but excited by what Jim wrote. Jim finished classes on August 27th, completed his last exam 3 days later, and then hitchhiked once more to Clearwater for a round of beach parties, dances, and drunks. On September 5th, he was back in Tallahassee, registering for the late Renaissance art history class, which included a further study of Bosch and several courses in the speech department. Introduction to the theater history, and essentials of acting, and the principles of scene design. Jim's plan was to lay a foundation for the classes in cinematography he was determined to take at UCLA, beginning in January. To that end, a few days after registering at FCU, Jim officially applied for his transfer, writing his old high school in Virginia to have his grades sent to the UCLA registrar. For this, his fourth and final trimester at FCU, Jim moved into room 206 at the Cherokee Hotel, a seedy downtown hostelry, many of which many of whose guests in years past had been the state legislators visiting the residents' prostitutes. The Cherokee wasn't a whorehouse at the time, says Brian Gates, but the reputation lingered on, and for Jim it was home. He felt genuinely comfortable there. Jim began to run with a small crowd of older students with some of the instructors and professors. Most of them hard-drinking party types in the art department. Within a few weeks, he moved out of the Cherokee and into a fourplex with the two of them. Now the emphasis was on good times. Once Jim got juiced on wine, and while engaging in a mock battle with umbrellas en route to a Saturday football game, he stole a cop's helmet from a patrol car. He was arrested and handcuffed, and in confusion that followed him, attempted to escape. The helmet disappeared, and Jim was charged with petty larceny.
Larceny.
What's larceny?
Theft.
Okay.
So.
As well as disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, and public drunkenness. The next day, Jim appeared at the home of Ralph Turner, the history professor for whom he'd written the paper on Bosch. He said he'd spent the night in the drunk tank and was afraid he'd have to move back on campus when the university heard about it. The professor, who hosted many parties, quickly agreed to help. Monday, Turner accompanied Jim to a barber shop, helped him borrow a suit, went to court with him, and later called the dean of men in his behalf. Jim was fined $50, a sum he had, but he was unwilling to part with, so he asked his mother to send it to him, not telling her why, and placed on university probation. The intercession of Ralph Turner and Jim's consistently high grades, as well as the respect of several other professors, were what kept him from harsher campus restrictions. He continued to dazzle his classmates and teachers. For his class in theater history, Jim wrote a tongue-in-cheek paper interpreting Waiting for Godot as a Civil War story because there was a Grant and a Lee and a slave in the cast. Godot? Where? Oh, Godot. That's how you say that?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Person, I don't know the play. It's just famous.
Okay. Waiting for Godot as a Civil War story because there was a Grant and a Lee and a slave in the cast. His scenic design professor remembers that one of Jim's proposed sets featured a nude male suspended over the stage as if crucified. Another for Cat on a hot tin roof called for a teeny spot of light on the rear wall at the part of the play that would grow until it covered the set, and it was revealed at the end of the slide of a cancer cell. The play's main character dies of cancer. Then, with no experience whatsoever, Jim got one of the two roles in the university production of Harold Printer's absurdist play, The Dumbwaiter. In the playbill, Jim assumed the stage name Stanislaus Belowski, created from the names of great Russian actor and producer Stanislavski, father of the method, and the stylish Polish director Richard Belowski, who had been with Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater before immigrating to the United States to make films. Jim's director, Sam Kilman, introduced him to the writing of Antonin Artaud, who wrote his cry for revolution in the theater from insane asylums during the 1930s and 1940s. We must recognize that the theater, like the plague, is a delirium, and it's communicative that is a secret of its fascination. Jim loved it. Jim was interesting to work with, says Keith Carlson, the actor who played opposite him in The Dumbwaiter. Every night waiting for the curtain to go up, I had no idea what he was going to do. He was difficult to key on because he tended to play the role with very differently all the time. He wasn't keen on me or in dialogue or in any traditional things. He played scenes and delivered lines with an inflection that seemed totally unmotivated or at least unexpected. There was a constant undercurrent of apprehension and feeling that things were on the brink of lost control. Back in those days, in 1963, everyone was uptight about any obscenity on stage, but we had some wonderfully obscene rehearsals. There was no obscenity during any of the performances, but with Jim, we just never knew. Your father's a captain now, Jim, his mother said, the captain of one of the biggest carriers in the world, the Bonhomme Richard. There are 3,000 men on that ship, and your father has their respect. And he has the respect because he is a fine disciplinarian. How would it look if his son, his very own son, showed up looking like a beatnik? On January 8th, 1964, Shortly before leaving his family in Coronado to begin classes at UCLA, Jim joined his father maneuvers in the Pacific, his hair freshly cut. Unfortunately, it wasn't cut short enough to please, and when Jim arrived at the Bonnie or Bonnie Dick, as the carrier was called, he was rushed to the ship's barber for another trim. This one exactly like the captain's own, clipper short on the back and sides, just long enough on the top to part. Jim was angry but silent. This is a picture of Jim and his dad. The captain was proud but wary. He took Jim to the bridge and introduced him to the officers. Jim shook hands and acknowledged the introductions graciously, without smiling. An official Navy photographer took some pictures. Later in the day, some human-like targets were tossed overboard, and Jim was given a machine gun and offered the opportunity to shoot at the objects bobbing in the ocean below. When Jim told the story of this afternoon, he did so with bitterness. He said that when his father returned home from commanding 3,000 men with such authority, he felt that at home his mother was in command. She told him to take the garbage out, Jim said. She hollered at him, and my father did it. He took the garbage out. It's not that crazy. A week later, with money enough for a small apartment about half a mile from the university, Jim went through the mid-year registration process, joining 20,000 other students at one of California's biggest campuses. Unlike her older sister university in Berkeley, UCLA was virtually apolitical. The students were tanned, athletic, and pleasing to look at, and their attire was casual and classless. By 1964, when Jim arrived, the film school was entering what the professors now called the Golden Age. The faculty included some of the top directors, Stanley Kramer, Jean Renoir, and Joseph von Sternberg among them. The students counted among themselves a score of brilliant and volatile personalities, including the young Francis Ford Coppola. Perhaps most important, the division had an exhilarating anarchic philosophy, which may have inspired Jim to write later. The good thing about film is that there aren't any experts. There's no authority on film. Any one person can assimilate and contain the whole history of film in himself, which you can't do in other arts. There are no experts, theoretically, any student knows almost as much as any professor.
Hey, I'm going to fall asleep. Will you grab Mr. Wendy and let me read for a few minutes?
Go ahead.
Jim's first 6 months at UCLA were unremarkable except for his Easter vacation, when he and two of his cinematography classmates, a somber, bearded New York intellectual and an older Irish girl, spent 3 drunken days in Tijuana. They don't even know their names? Okay, anyway. During the remainder of the spring semester, it's a very useless paragraph. Jim's first 6 months at UCLA were unremarkable except for his Easter vacation, when he and two of his cinematography classmates, a somber, bearded New York intellectual and an older Irish girl, spent 3 drunken days in Tijuana.
Are you saying it's useless because they don't know the names?
Well, yeah, it's like, okay, it's not attached to anything else. Yeah. During the remainder of the spring semester, Jim stuck to his leisurely routine. Classes in scattered buildings on the huge tree-lined campus, long hours of reading alone in the university libraries or in his tiny apartment, and on Sunday, calls to Mary in Florida using a public telephone, paying only for the first 3 minutes, but usually talking for an hour or more, neglecting to signal when through. Afternoons and evenings, Jim sometimes went to the Lucky U, a Mexican restaurant and bar about a mile from campus.
I think you just started exactly where I started yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's kind of a trip, though, right? Like how he made his calls on Sunday.
Mhm.
Like, afternoon and evenings, Jim sometimes went to the Lucky U, a Mexican restaurant and bar about a mile from campus, not far from the Veterans Hospital. He enjoyed the place. There were lady bartenders and blind men pushing legless friends in wheelchairs, the legless calling directions. Sometimes the cripples got drunk and fought, battling it out with crutches. It reminded Jim of a Nelson Algren story. He called it a neat place to drink. Weekends, Jim went to Venice Beach. Venice had been a mecca for the Beat generation in the 1950s, and the bohemian tradition clung to it. Poets, painters, and students lived cheaply in big rooms in once elegant Victorian homes or in cabins beside the crumbling canals. When summer came, Jim returned to Coronado. He was thin after 4 months of poor or missed meals, but he soon regained his characteristic chubbiness. Then he was off to Mexico again, this time with his brother and his godfather, a retired Navy officer who had served with Steve in the Pacific. Andy remembers it as a drunken trip. We drove about 100 miles south to Ensenada. Jim showed me life. I was drinking beers, and he was carrying me from bar to bar, arguing with the Mexicans in Spanish when they tried to shortchange us, talking to the whores, racing through alleys, being chased by dogs. It was great. Back in San Diego, in the San Diego area.
One of the dogs that chased him.
No, I know. Probably one of his ancestors. He said, "Get out of here, you stupid gringo." Back in the San Diego area, Jim and Andy up. What? Hey.
Stop that.
Often went to movie theaters on the post, and sometimes Jim would sneak in wine and get drunk. On military bases, a film of the flag is routinely shown after the feature, and the national anthem is played. Once Jim filled the theater with his voice. "Oh, say can you?" He was the only one singing. Jim didn't have much to do in Coronado, and he grew bored and restless. Soon he began to plead to be allowed to return to school early so he could make up his incomplete in history. In early August, he left, promising to look for a part-time job. By the end of summer, Jim was a student assistant in the theater arts library, returning books to shelves and posting overdue notices for $1.25 an hour. It was a simple job, but he failed to keep it. A new librarian arrived and fired Jim in October. When it became apparent he wasn't interested in reporting to work on time. Then Mary appeared. She quickly found a job at the UCLA Medical Center and, much to Jim's dismay, took an apartment of her own. She said she was going to find an agent and look for dancing jobs. Maybe someday they could make a film together. Friends say Jim was as pleased as they ever saw him that fall at UCLA. Even if things weren't precisely as he had planned then, he and his beloved Mary were together in California at last. Jim began to collect a small circle of friends from among the most enigmatic and explosive students at the film school. The four who were closest to him were individually taken, rather naive or innocent, but together they came across as sinister, or at the very least slightly bent. The oddest was Dennis Jacob, a timid yet often belligerent graduate student of massive intelligence, who was privately called the Rat or the Weasel because of his scuttling walk and a back bent from so many hours hunched over an editing machine. Dennis was a man possessed, the virtual reincarnation of the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein. Eventually, he would serve as a special assistant to Francis Coppola on Apocalypse Now. One of the reasons Jim was attracted to Dennis was he had read as many or more books than Jim had. It was Nietzsche's works that they discussed most often. By the time they met, Jim had read most of the German philosopher's writings, The Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil. He had read while still in high school. More recently, he discovered The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, a slender volume that would join Norman O'Brown's Life Against Death as a deep influence. The book, Nietzsche's first, is truly revolutionary and one of the most relevant statements ever made on tragedy. It is concerned with the classic conflict between the Apollonian art of sculpture, thank you, and the Dionysian art of music. Like Nietzsche, Jim identified with the long-suffering Dionysius, who was, without any images, himself pure primordial pain and its primordial re-echoing. But for the suffering there was ample reward. The resolution was not in transcendence of one's individual consciousness, but rather in an ecstatic disillusion of personal consciousness in the primal nature of the universe, what Jim and others came to call the universal mind. The universal mind. The resolution, for the suffering there was an ample reward. The resolution was not in transcendence of one's individual consciousness, but rather in an ecstatic disillusion of personal consciousness. So it's not in getting more conscious or aware, but it's in the purposeful and sort of joyful, robust destruction of your consciousness.
Do you see what I'm saying?
And that is the universal mind, the primal nature of the universe. So at the heart of it, they think, Jim thinks that's the way to go. To, like that room, yeah, okay. To self destruct is a pure expression or something. Hi. Janice and Jim would sit discussing Nietzsche for hours, arguing occasionally but generally agreeing ardently, reading long passages from the philosopher's works aloud to each other. One day, talking about Dionysius, and remembering the line from William Blake, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it truly is, infinite, which gave Aldous Huxley the title for his book, The Doors of Perception. Jim and Dennis decided to form a band. They told a friend they were going to call themselves The Doors, open and closed. The second student in Jim's group was John DeBela, the vain and lusty son of a Brooklyn policeman who was as proud of the 200 books he read each year as he was of his well-muscled 6'2" body. During the week, campus legend credited him with visiting bookstores in a long black raincoat with dozens of pockets sewn inside for stealing the books he coveted. Weekends, he went to Muscle Beach to look for girls. John's physical nature and exaggerated but genuine worldliness made him seem the antithesis of Dennis Jacob, but there were similarities. One, of course, was his love of books and doctrinaire philosophies. Another was his age. Like Dennis, he was older than Jim, 25. A third was his verbal facility, and both were Catholics. When Dennis or John began to weave an intellectual tapestry, Jim was fascinated. Shamanism, John said. We were into the shaman, the poet inspired. We were all into that. Part of the vague philosophy of the UCLA film students was you blur the distinction between dreams and reality. One of my favorite lines was, dreams beget reality. Phil Eleno was heavy into Jungian psychology, and we were picking up a lot of lore from him. We had a theory of the true rumor, that life wasn't as exciting and romantic as it should be. So you tell things that are false because it is better that images be created. It doesn't matter that they aren't true so long as they are believed. Oh, so this is sort of like, this would be Trump's thing. The true rumor, that life wasn't as exciting and romantic as it should be. So you tell things that are false because it's better that images be created. It doesn't matter that they aren't true as long as they are believed. So isn't it surprising, isn't it, that Donald Trump's into Jungian psychology?
Mr. Wonderful was just licking my arm.
When they were bored, Jim and John devised amusements. Once Jim and Phil Eleno, a close friend of both, allegedly challenged John to a book-stealing competition at the university bookstore. The one who escaped with the highest retail value in 1 hour was the winner. Another time, Jim and John decided they'd pick up a stranger, get stoned, go to the music library where they take turns playing their favorite records. Laughing, they talked a girl into it, played the records, started smoking grass, and soon John was making a play for her. She must have thought Jim offered more promise, and she went on with him, telling him how her boyfriend had gotten her pregnant, and then she'd contracted a venereal disease, which was followed by a uterine operation that made her sterile, and the details of her life came pouring out, accompanied by choking tears. Jim was reminded of the Dylan Thomas story.
Look at in the camera.
Oh, Wendy. Was reminded of the Dylan Thomas story, The Followers, in which two young boys casually meet and find they both have horror in their lives. Another time, Jim and John got drunk at the Lucky U, and Jim insisted on visiting the public library not far away. John reluctantly walked over with him and followed him into the stacks at a leisurely pace, checking out the skirt links and pantyhose in the reading room. When he caught up with Jim, he was urinating on the floor between two shelves of books. John grabbed him and began to move him out. A woman approached. "Hey, lady," Jim called. "Hey, lady." With his dark...
That's it.
Yeah, he's peeing in the library. Okay. Another time, Jim and John got drunk at the Lucky U, and Jim insisted on visiting the public library not far away. John reluctantly walked over with him and followed him into the stacks at a leisurely pace, checking out the skirt links and pantyhose in the reading room. Oh, wait, sorry. With his dark wavy hair, broad present face, and thick chest, Philoleno, the third friend, looked a little like a slightly larger version of Jim. He was 23, 2 years older than Jim, and was the only one in the circle who lived at home, a circumstance that earned him Jim and John's periodic harassment. Phil had read nearly everything written by or about Carl Jung. On a shelf in his room, at home, were all the books, heavily underlined with a thick black pencil. Jung was not Jim's favorite psychoanalyst, and he and Phil loved to argue after seeing movies how the filmmaker's symbolism might be interpreted along Jungian, or in Jim's case, Ferencian lines. Like Jung, Sandor Ferenczi was an associate of Freud's who cut himself loose, becoming a Freudian deviant in method more than theory. While Freud recommended sexual abstinence for his patients, arguing that this would concentrate the libido on past emotional experiences, Ferenczi took the denial much further, trying to persuade his patients to give up much of their eating, drinking, defecation, and urination as well. Then he swung the opposite way towards love and permissiveness, believing that neurotics were people who had never been loved or accepted by their parents, and what they really needed was affection, warmth, and coddling. As is generally true when talking about psychoanalysis, the conversations were filled with sexual references, often ranging over a wide assortment of neuroses, fetishes, and abnormalities, from hermaphroditism, necrophilia, to masochism, sadism, and homosexuality. So when Jim and Phil made a film together, the subject was not surprising. They had talked of making several films. One of Phil's ideas was to capture something of the life of Rimbaud, and he asked Jim if he'd like to play the leading role. Another Jim's suggestion was to show the famous scene from Nietzsche's life where he comes upon a man beating a horse and forcefully stops the beating. The soundtrack for this short film, Jim said, would be applause. Neither of these films was made. The one they did made had no intellectual pretensions but was a joke. Jim and Phil were taking only beginning courses in camera, lighting, sound, and editing, but even neophytes at the film school were expected to use whatever education and imagination they had to produce a film. It didn't have to be long or complicated or even good. The object was to get the student familiar with the tools. Actually, Phil didn't make a film, but satisfied the requirement by hiring himself out to some graduate students in the psychology department who were making a film under top secret conditions that was to be kept thereafter in the department safe. It was of a man and a woman, both nude, simulating the positions and actions of lovemaking. With Phil's assistance, Jim obtained outtakes, spliced them together in climatic sequence, and used the end of Ravel's Bolero for a soundtrack. At the screening, the students were hilariously amused, and most of the instructors and professors were incensed. Jim was told he deserved the worst grade possible, and he was marked down as a troublemaker, a designation that would cause him to be assigned to a special workshop class of problem students the following semester. Oh, my chest hurts.
Mr. Marvel's hammed it up for the camera.
He sure is. Here, let me take over. The student screening.
The student screening were held twice a year and at the end of each semester's workshop sessions. Other screenings were held more regularly, usually on Friday nights. Invited professionals from the nearby film factories would show one of their films and then open themselves, or so they thought, to a friendly question and answer session. The program was canceled when the students persisted in harassing the lecturers. The ringleader of those screenings, the student generally thought to be the blackest, noisiest, and most cynical, was another of Jim's closest friends, the fourth arch cook of the Golden Age, a luxurious blonde Mephistopheles, whatever, named Felix been able. Felix's love of booze and pills and all-night storytelling sessions reminded Jim of the hero on the road, Dean Moriarty. Felix was, at 34, the oldest student in the film school. He had come to UCLA after 13 years of odd jobs, including one long period as a bus driver and another as a boat builder. Most of the jobs had been in San Francisco area, where he had attended the University of California at Berkeley from 1948 to 1952. Though he had failed to graduate, he was readily accepted into UCLA as a graduate student anyway, perhaps because his grades at Berkeley, one half of them A's and the other half F's, persisted. Such an intriguing record, perhaps because when a man is 34 and he wants a degree, he should be given the opportunity to get one. Like John DeBella, Felix liked to talk about himself, and his tales were generally less boastful and funnier. Felix was not so intellectual as Jim's other close friends at the film school, but the attachment was no less tight. Stanton Kay, who used Felix as the major character in one of his films, believed that the relationship was based in part of a psychological likeness. I felt that Felix was coming apart as a man, not having any definition or identity, being older and feeling the corrosive pressures of society much more because of it. He was helpless almost to the point of impotence. He was in constant anxiety, and so, of course, was Jim. I saw this profound nihilism. Nihilism? What's that?
Nothing matters.
Okay. Sense of despair that was stronger than my own. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was that's where the despair came from. The voyeur, Jim scrawled in one of his notebooks, is a dark comedian. He is repulsive in the dark enormity and his secret invasion. He went on to describe the threat and power of the silent partnership made with the unsuspecting. There were hundreds of notes like this. Some of them would be published 4 years later, first privately, then by Simon and Schuster at the Lord's Notes on Vision. While Jim was at UCLA, they surfaced as a paper on film aesthetics. He wasn't able to make films yet, so he could think and write about film and art. The appeal of cinema lies in the fear of death. Pages of his notebook were filled with film lore, much of it learned from John DeBella. On other pages, Jim struggled for definitions. Images of magic and violence and sex and death ran through his notebook. Books like a dark river. Kennedy was killed with the sniper's injurious vision, and Oswald found haven, devoured in the warm and dark silent maw of physical theater. Oedipus made an appearance. You may look at things but not taste them. You may caress the mother only with the eyes. It seemed that more he saw, the more he experienced, the more he wrote, the more he wrote, the more he seemed to understand. Jim buried himself in his notebooks as he threw open his psych for examination. I won't come out, he wrote. You must come into me, into my womb garden, where I peer out, where I can construct a universe within the skull to revive the real. Vile the real. The end of 1964, after a history-making cruise into the Indian Ocean and sure of strength and participation in the Gulf of Tonkin incident off Vietnam, Captain Morrison held his final officer's push-up contest on the Bonhomme Richard. He always won. Turned the carrier over to another man and began packing for another move, this one to London, where he would serve under the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Naval Forces Europe. But first he would travel to the West Coast to take a brief vacation with his family. Jim spent Christmas at home, and then his family left for jaunt to Florida to visit relatives. It was the last time Jim ever saw his parents.
That's pretty good.
The January rains...
Because he lived a lot longer after that. I think this is like 8 years before he died or so. Yeah.
January raids receded, and the film school students began hanging out at the Gypsy Wagon, a small snack bar on the wheels not far from the cinematography bungalows. There, mixing with student musicians and artists, Jim and many of his classmates exhibited what one of Jim's fellow students, Bill Kirby, came to call the film school bullshit and flash. Gliding through school, expending as little effort as possible while covering up this inactivity with a thick layer of swagger and buncombe. Okay. Jim walked along fences, yelling and shouting on the way to class, filled up the walls in the men's room with pungent graffiti, and rolled empty wine bottles down the aisles of theaters.
And what type of graffiti do you think it was? What was he drawing on the...
Penises.
Yes, right.
Then the classic stories began, most having as their focus drugs, nudity, or deviltry. One combined all three and had Jim getting drunk and climbing one of the campus towers at midnight to strip and throw his clothes to the ground. With an image he wrote in his notebook, "There is no attendant danger." Also, rolling empty wine bottles down aisles is not as crazy as they feel like they think it is. Some of the instructors appreciated Jim making allowances for what one called his, what is that?
Dilettantism.
And Jim himself liked several instructors. His favorite was Ed Browick, who told
Brokaw.
Brokaw.
Do you want me to take over?
No.
Okay.
Who told his classes outrageous lies to see if anyone was listening. Jim especially liked the fact that, how would you say it?
Brokaw.
Brokaw occasionally disappeared for several days, as Jim himself would in later years. Brokaw would have been drawn to Jim's destructiveness, says Colin Young, head of the film division. He would have smelt it and warmed his hands around the fire because of how often that connected to his real talent. Brokaw was Jim's faculty advisor, and it was him that Jim went to see to say he was dropping out. Then he went to Colin Young and said the same thing. Jim's decision to quit came only a week or two before the end of classes, following a 2-day screening of student films. This was the main event of the student year, as close as a final examination as anything the film school offered. Although graduation did not depend on whether a student's film was accepted for a subsequent public showing at UCLA's Royce Hall, the competition for acceptance was great. Most of the 40 or so film screens that may had been made in the Project 170 workshop classes, in which film short silence films with voiceover or soundover tracks were made. Filming was normally done on Saturdays, and the procedure was for every student to fill all roles, serving as a cameraman one week and actor the next, a soundman the third, so on, at some point directing his own film. Jim did not produce the script for his film, telling John DeBella, whom he had picked his cameraman, "I'll explain things as we go." What Jim had in mind, as he explained later, was a film that was questioning the film process itself. A film about film. It was untitled and took the form of a montage or sequence of abstract and loosely connected events, what DeBella called at the time a diffuse medley of images about the filmmaker and the filmmaker's eyes. It opened with Jim taking a huge pull from a pipe full of grass and throwing his head back. Then the camera cut to the wiggly test pattern used as a title logo on the Outer Limits television show. There followed a scene of a woman, DeBella's tall German girlfriend, dressed only in a bra, panties, and garter belt, with the camera panning slowly down from her face to show her spiked heels dancing on top of a television set that had been turned on to reveal Nazi soldiers marching in parade. Then came a scene in an apartment Jim's whose halls were covered in Playboy nudes that had been used as targets for darts. Several men got stoned, then seated themselves to watch stag movies, but the film broke, and the men jumped up and began to make finger shadows against the white light on the screen. After that, there was a close-up of a girl licking DeBella's eyeball, cleansing it of the filth collected from the images it had seen. The final shot was of the television set being turned off, and the picture fading to the white line, and then to a dot, and then to darkness. The screening was as chaotic as the film. First, the splices came apart and the film couldn't go through the projector. Jim was told to resplice it for a later showing that night. When he did, the reaction ranged from confusion to amusement to discontent. Some of the students thought Jim deranged, and a few had any comment to make, although most howled with delight to see DeBella's girlfriend in her underwear. Even Ed Brokaw, who generally was intrigued by Jim's mind, palpitated in imaginary basketball with his fingers bouncing his left hand against his right and saying, "Jim, I'm terribly disappointed in you." The film was not included in the Royce Hall lineup, and Jim was giving a complimentary tea. Jim was hurt by the rejection. Some say he went outside and cried. Oh, who cares? Boo-hoo. Whether or not this is true, he clearly was embittered. I don't know how to say it.
Embittered.
Oh. First he became defensive, then petulant, and finally he announced his immediate departure from UCLA. That's a big baby move. Colin Young talked him out
No
of
one
it.
understands him, right?
Yeah, no one understands Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
But in June, when it came time for him to collect his diploma, Jim was walking the Venice beach smoking dope. By now, Jim and Mary were drifting apart. She still insisted on including stardom in her destiny, a conviction Jim had humored at first and then tried to discourage. Then she said she might audition as a go-go dancer at the Whiskey A Go-Go, a club that had opened on Sunset Strip in January. Jim told her he didn't want her in a short fringed skirt and a glass cage shaking her ass for middle-aged drunks. They fought again when she had an agent who told her not to appear in a film Jim wanted to make because it would be damaging to her career to be in a student film. They fought a third time when Mary appeared unexpectedly at Jim's apartment and caught him with another girl. Jim told Mary she had no right to come to his place unless she was invited. That's dumb. Besides the fights, there were the polite but annoying reminders that, in her opinion, he was taking too many drugs. Jim saw Ray Manzarak coming across the campus.
Ray Manzarak.
Ray Manzarak. That sounds like 5 different words.
He's the cool guy.
Okay, if you say so.
No, he is.
Jim saw Ray Manzarak coming across the campus. Ray was a friend of John DeBella's. Jim admired Ray and had secretly applauded his refusal to edit a nude shower scene from a film he'd made of his girlfriend. Jim was additionally attracted to Ray's music and had been to hear him in his band, Rick and the Ravens, at the Turkey Joint West in Santa Monica, a nearby beach community. Did they really have to specify what Santa Monica was?
I know, that's what I thought too. It's like New York City, a city on the East Coast that's popular.
Once Ray had invited Jim on stage with several others from the film school, and everyone full of beer crashed through a chorus of Louie Louie. Now in June, Ray's band had hired to back up Sonny and Cher at a high school graduation dance. But when one of the band members quit and Ray called the school to say that there'd be 5 musicians instead of 6, he was told that he didn't produce the 6 musicians as contracted. They wouldn't be paid. "Hey man," said Ray, swatted Jim. "Want to play a gig with us?" "I don't play anything, Ray." "That's okay. All you have to do is stand there and hold an electric guitar, and we'll just run the cord around behind one of the amps. Won't even plug it in." Jim said afterward that was the easiest money he'd ever made. All right, end of part 1.
Coming up next is The Arrow Flies. All right. Okay, that was pretty painful. But
Shout out to Jeff.
oh yeah, Jeff Lilly. Shout out to Jeff Lilly.
This one's for you.
Yeah, it's for you, Jeff.
Say hi. He's shy. He's camera shy. It's okay though. It's okay, baby.